So question one is, how do we reuse our KeyShot scenes or save them to be reused with different products? And I really like this question because it's something that both individuals and teams can benefit from. You can save yourselves a lot of time and create more consistent images if we start from the same file or the same starting point or template each time. And there's actually a very easy way to do this in KeyShot, which I'm gonna walk you through right now. Okay, so let's say we want to reuse this KeyShot scene as a starting point for future KeyShot projects with different products. You can see right now we've got one model, it's this glue gun, and I also have a custom HDRI with some warm and cool lighting coming from different sides. I also have my rendering preset set to product, and I've also got a few different standard camera views that I want to save as well. And to top it all off, I have a custom image style that gives me more drama. Now let's say I want to use this as a starting point every time I import a new a new model to render in KeyShot. So here's how we're going to do this. We're going to go up to Edit, Clear Geometry, and we get a warning. We say yes. And what this has done is it's removed our 3D model from our scene, but it has everything else in here that we had already set up. Now we have to save this as a KeyShot startup scene. So we'll go with File and Save As. And now I get to choose what I want to save this as and where I want to save it. Well, I want to go and save this to my desktop. And I'll go ahead and call this KS_startup1. And I'll go ahead and hit Save. And it says our camera's 3/4 is in an unsafe state. I want to discard the current camera position. And now, if I go ahead and close this, I want to take this startup scene from my desktop and put it in a different folder. So inside my KeyShot 9 directory, and this is going to be different on everyone's computer, but depending on how you installed it on your machine, if you're on a PC, it's likely going to be in your user folder, documents, and then in KeyShot 9. Now I went ahead and made a new folder called startup scenes. And I'm gonna go in there and I'm going to drag my KeyShot startup scene that we just created into our startup scene folder. Now I need to go and launch KeyShot so I can tell the preferences to load this every time we start a new scene. So notice I open a new KeyShot scene and we have our startup environment and we have our plain old settings, no cameras, nothing like that. So we're going to go to Edit, Preferences, and we want to go into our General area. And then from here, we should have the option to change a default startup scene. And right now it uses startup.bip. Let's click on the folder to load a new startup scene. And we're going to go from not KeyShot scenes, go back to KeyShot 9, find our startup scenes folder and choose our custom startup. Hit OK or open and then save changes. And let's relaunch KeyShot and see how it works. So we can go ahead and launch KeyShot one more time. And now we have the same dark gray background. We've got the standard cameras. We've got that custom lighting environment. And just to show how this works, if I go and load a new model like this power bank, I'm going to drag that into our current scene. And we're going to take the default import settings. And now you can see the new model is right where I want it. I've got a couple of standard camera views. There's our front view. Here's our right side view, kind of looking down, I guess. And then our 3/4 view. And it's not perfect. It's a little off center, so I could go and update this camera. But this has a lot to do with the model I had in here before had a long cable sticking out from it. So that model was already off center to begin with. Now this model is truly centered in our scene. So had we started off with a model that was centered to begin with, all our cameras should be focused on this. If I go ahead and put some basic materials on here, like hard, rough, black plastic, in fact, I'm just gonna put this on everything. So we'll go ahead and grab our materials and link materials. And let's go ahead and take our model and lift it up off the ground, kind of tilt it down a little bit. There we go. And we can see now, hopefully, that we have saved ourselves a lot of time by using a startup scene. Now, if you're going to use this approach, I would recommend that you create a startup scene for similar sized objects. So maybe have one startup scene for products under 12 by 12 inches, and then another for products under 3 by 3 feet, and so on. That way your lighting in your cameras will already be fairly accurate for the size of product you're beginning or starting with. So hopefully that answers some questions and give you ideas. Last but not least, you can't choose which startup scene you want to launch with each time. So in the case of having multiple startup scenes, what you could do is just begin by opening that startup scene for the appropriate sized object. And then from here, just going ahead and importing your model into it. So super good question. I hope that helps you out and saves you some time. Next, we have a question on file management. How do we manage KeyShot projects on multiple computers? So whether you're using multiple computers yourself or you're on a team where each person's on their own machine, but you want to share and work on the same KeyShot projects, here's what I recommend. You use a cloud system to manage it. So whether you use Microsoft OneDrive, Dropbox, Google Drive, totally up to you. Maybe you want to use Apple's, storage system, whatever it is, doesn't matter. Just basically make sure that your cloud syncing service works for your needs, is fast enough for what you expect it to do, and then make sure you have a folder on each computer that is a offline version of that cloud storage space. So I use Google Drive for my business, and I basically have a dedicated disk or a drive on each computer within my little studio here. And I make sure that Google Drive mirrors the same data across each individual drive on each machine. So it's pretty cost effective. If you need to store more than 1 terabyte though, it's worth looking at either other Earth services or maybe even a NAS server or an individual dedicated computer for that. But my short answer is going to be use some sort of cloud storage. So our next question says, how do we render in backgrounds? And I think they're talking about adding context to a rendering, something to make your product look like it's within an environment other than just say a white or a solid colored backdrop. There's a lot of ways we can do this. KeyShot has a thing called backplates, which is really cool. And sometimes I use a hybrid approach of actually using a bit of geometry and then placing an image on it and then having that cast light into my scene. So I'm actually going to show you a cool project in which I use that approach here so you can get some ideas of how it can help make a more convincing environment for your renderings. So I thought this scene would be a good example of a couple of different approaches for rendering in a background to your model or your scene. So this is one way that I mentioned that I would call hybrid approach. We have a bunch of models in the foreground, and then using depth of field on our camera, our background progressively gets blurrier as it gets behind our objects. And it's kind of hard to tell where our 3D model ends and our background begins. Well, if I go to my camera and turn off depth of field, you will see the image gets clear. And if I move my camera around the scene, you will notice that I have a 3D setup in front of an image that is then also contributing to my environment a little bit. So this is not necessarily the way backplates work, but this is, again, as I call it, a hybrid approach to lighting in KeyShot with backgrounds. So if I double click on this object, first you will notice we have a plane or a cube that has this image on it. So this plane is just an emissive material. Again, you could use area light as well, both accept image textures. But the point is, if they are outputting light, then they will illuminate your scene a little bit. So let's go and turn our environment brightness down so you can see what I mean. So I turn off my light coming from my environment. You will see that this image is actually contributing to the light within my scene, and any shiny objects in my scene will reflect this environment or this image, making it much more realistic and makes these two blend together. So this is one option I really like. Now, you don't want to use too much light on this because this doesn't look realistic. But if we make this now a smaller number that's not so bright, And if we use an environment that has a bit more of the tones or the colors that we want, we can kind of use the two together to blend everything in. So that's one approach I recommend for rendering in backgrounds. This is a little bit more complex than the other option we have, which is to use a backplate. So if I hide this, so after hiding that, if I want to use just a backplate, I can go to my library of backplates and just double click on an image to apply it or drag it in to use it as a backplate. So if I drag an image into my scene, you will see now my 3D model is still visible, but instead of seeing our environment behind it, we see a still image. So if we have a background that is suitable, maybe this kitchen here works a little bit better, I would then say line my products up. Let's hide a couple more of my props here. I could take my 3D scene like this and kind of move it until it matched the environment a little bit more. We have to worry about our camera too to make sure that the settings look accurate. And of course, then we have to worry about shadows and all that type of thing. But one thing I want to make clear is our products, like our bowl, like our 3D models, our glass, everything, that's reflecting our HDRI, not this backplate. In fact, there is no actual interaction between a backplate and the rest of your 3D model. They don't reflect one another. They don't cast shadows on, or lights on each other. The copper color of these objects are not seen or influencing the object here. The only difference is that if my material is clear, you'll see it behind it. And if you turn on depth of field, like we had in the very beginning, you'll notice that our background does not get blurry, but our stuff does, our 3D models do. Well, that's because our background, once again, does not interact with the scene. So one other reason I very much like to use a backdrop, like I showed you, is because it's in 3D space. So when let's actually show you the geometry view on the right here, you can see this plane with our background on it is in 3D space. So if I turn on my camera's depth of field, let's go to that front view again, you'll see in here that my camera's focal point is on my objects, and the stuff that gets further away from those blue planes gets more and more blurry. So if I want to exaggerate the blurriness of this background, all I have to do is move this closer and it will get less blurry, or further and it will get more blurry. And then of course you have to size it accordingly. But to be quite honest, this is my favorite approach for making realistic backgrounds in KeyShot. I hope that gives you a new tactic or a new way to solve that problem. So the next question is asking, how do we create different marble finishes from nothing? And I assume what you're asking is, how can we use KeyShot only to create different marble finishes or materials? And my short answer is going to be the material graph. You're going to have to get creative and actually use our KeyShot procedural marble, which is a texture in KeyShot, and then manipulate it and get creative with how you overlay it in different orientations to create a different look. But it's certainly possible, and I'll show you a little bit how to do that here. This marble I have here is not so convincing, unfortunately. Now, if we go into our environment and look at the marble materials that exist, I'm going to go ahead and search M-A-R-B-L-E, and we'll see there's a few options that come stock in KeyShot. And if I use marble black, we'll see it's got this big texture. If we use marble, there's a few variants of this. We've got black, advanced translucent. Try that one. And you may or may not notice a huge difference. We also have the same variants with white. We've got just like a basic, and then we have more of an advanced version. So let's take a look at these and see why they differ. This material, I'm going to hide everything except for this part here. So let's take a look at this material here. If I double click on it, we're going to look at its material graph. This is the white advanced translucent, and I'm going to go with the black version just because it might be easier to see on your monitor. Okay, inside our material property, we see this is a translucent material type, and marble technically is translucent. It has subsurface scattering within it. So depending on what you're going for and how realistic you want to be, you may consider using something like translucent instead of a basic plastic material, which is what the basic version of this is going to look like. If we go into this here, we see it's just a basic plastic. And when we look in its material graph, we see our root node, we see the plastic material it's made out of, and then we see a texture called marble. And this is a procedural texture. You can get this by right-clicking and going down to textures, and then marble. That's it. And then it's plugged into the diffuse, which is our color of our plastic. It's also plugged into the roughness of our plastic. And then we have a different texture called a noise texture plugged into the bump channel of our plastic. This noise texture is also a procedural, so they're all accessible through a right click. And if we want to preview these, you can click and hit C, and this will give you a preview of the color that's coming from this texture into our plastic. And if we get out of that and we look at our color to number here for our roughness, it's very hard to see. It's mostly all glossy. And here we also have our noise texture, like this, creating some sort of rippled effect on the surface. Now, the question was, how do we make different marbles? Well, you can start off with what's already in the KeyShot library, and then you can customize them. So for this marble, we could take its vein thickness and make them larger or skinnier, and that's going to give you an entirely different look. We can scale the whole thing down if the texture's too big for your liking. We can play with the vein noise, which makes it more random and squiggly. Take it all away and you just have parallel lines. You can play with the noise scale, again, which will give you different shapes and distributions of this kind of squiggly part. And you can also go and rotate the texture as well, because it's a 3D texture, so it runs all the way through the object. So depending on its orientation, it's going to give you different appearances, okay? Now, if you want to really push this, and if this is already fairly similar or basic for you, you can examine the advanced version. Let's try that. And look at its material graph, and you'll see it's got more nodes going on. We have a primary marble, I guess, pattern or texture here. Then we have a secondary here. And then we have a tertiary over here. And they're all slightly different, and they're oriented and scaled a little bit differently. And when combined, they're supposed to give you some different looks and effects. And we have a different noise texture. I mean, it's still pretty basic, but it gives you more options. This should give you an idea of how you can mix and match different textures to really customize materials. Now, if you want something that really looks totally different than the built-in KeyShot marble procedural texture, then you are going to have to use image-based textures, which you can find on websites like polygon.com and CG Textures and all sorts of stuff like that. If you're interested, head on over to willgibbons.com/learn, and you're going to find all the resources to all the websites that I think are worth recommending that have assets that you can use for your own product rendering visualization stuff. So the next question asks, what are the best render settings for a low to mid-range spec PC? And I totally understand that CPU rendering is going to take a long time if you don't have a really beefy system. Of course, GPU rendering is the same. If you have a very basic graphics card, then you might struggle with long render times, and that's totally understandable. And the first thing I would say is actually a boring answer, and that is to do your research or homework. Get online, and whether you're using KeyShot or even some other software, just read the manual about the render settings, and that's going to explain to you what each little slider or option does. And the better you actually understand these settings, the better you can optimize your render settings and not just waste time. If you crank everything all the way up, you're going to make your computer work harder, but the image isn't going to look any better just because you had higher settings necessarily. So really understand what matters the most. So that said, I'll go ahead and take a look at our render settings and give you some recommendations as to how I would save render time. Okay, so when it comes to render settings for machines that aren't super powerful, I've got a few recommendations for you. The first one is going to be the most simple, and that is render your image smaller so it's not so large. The smaller you can render your image, the faster it will go. Now, if you're going to just keep your images online or share them on Instagram or your portfolio online, no need to go higher than 1920 by 1080p. So when you go to render, in your render settings, just set it down to 1920 by 1080 and you are off to the races. No need to go any bigger than that, to be honest. Now, if a client's asking you to go larger than this, and you must, go ahead and go larger, but then you're gonna wanna consider some of your render settings. So we can go to our lighting tab to see our real-time render settings, and these numbers control what we see right here in KeyShot in the middle of our screen. If we go to basic mode, in fact, let's go down to performance mode. Performance mode looks the worst because it's not realistic. However, it renders fast. How do I know it renders fast? Well, if I hit the H key for heads-up display, we see the samples climbing up very quickly. We also see our frames per second is very fast. Now, assuming your computer is already using all of its cores, I should have said this earlier, but you can adjust how much KeyShot has access to your CPU cores. So the higher number here, the faster it will render. But know that if you're multitasking or doing anything else on your computer, it might struggle to operate very smoothly. So if you can, don't run any other software when you're rendering. And then set this number to the highest number possible. Now, I have plenty of cores on my machine and I'm recording right now, so I'm gonna keep this back down to 50%. So more cores will get you to run faster. Then you can keep an eye on your frames per second, and this number goes up or down depending on how fast your computer is, a lot of other factors. So another thing you can do is if we go up to basic mode, you will notice our image looks better, a little bit more realistic, but your frames per second goes down slower. It drops to, in my case, about a quarter of what it was. And the samples are going up slower now. If we continue to go down our list of presets, we're going to increase all of our render settings, but it ends up going slower and slower the higher we set our render settings. So the idea is to know how high is high enough on your render settings to get you a good looking image, but not sacrifice too much render time. And I will tell you, I never change the shadow quality. If my shadows look good to me, then I leave these where they're at. This is going to deal with things like the graininess within your shadows, things like that. Now, ground illumination is going to allow the ground plane to accept light from other sources. We don't see a ground plane here. I'm using actual 3D geometry instead of a instead of a simulated ground plane. So I could turn this checkbox off. Nothing is going to change visually here as a result of that, and that may save me some render time. We always want self shadows on because if we don't have it, it won't look realistic. So leave that on. Now ray bounces are needed every time light transmits through a material. And so this glass has a front surface, a back surface, and then if light was going through in a straight arrow, it would take up 2 ray bounces here and 2 ray bounces here, and then it could keep going. Well, we really only need ray bounces for bounce light as well as transparent objects. If I set this down to something like 6 and hit enter, you don't notice a big difference. Now the bottom of our glass might be a little bit darker because of that. If I go back up to 14, it gets a little bit lighter. Some of the light moves all the way through there. But if I take this back down to 6 and we don't mind that darker area down here, this will render significantly faster than if we have 14 ray bounces. So the fewer the ray bounces you have, the faster it will render, but you are risking a little bit of realism. Global illumination will also affect your render speed. If we turn this off, you may not notice a huge difference. So if it doesn't look bad to you, you can go ahead and turn it off. But I recommend leaving it on because it is realistic. It's going to render bounce light that bounces off objects indirectly, which is important for realism. Now, caustics, if we wanted to turn them on, we could. That will really slow down our render speed. And in this case, we're not going to benefit from caustics because we don't have light moving through these transparent materials or off these metallic surfaces in a way that creates very good looking caustics. Now, if we had our light creating these really flashy looking designs on the ground because of caustics, we could turn this on, but then we'd have to wait a long time to let it render. So I say turn this off unless you really need it. Last but not least, you could use interior mode. If I go to this, you'll notice the whole thing may render a little bit faster and look smooth and not as grainy. That's okay. if you don't mind the way the materials look. Some of the materials might not read as well when rendered with interior mode than they do, or as they do in product mode. In my opinion, this looks pretty good. It's not a bad option, but I prefer product mode for some subtle differences. And if you're running KeyShot 9, you now have access to something called a denoiser in our image styles. So what does that mean? It's this icon in the upper left-hand corner called denoise. If I turn this, let's see, if I set it to 1 and I turn it off, you will see that the image may look a little bit grainy. Now, let me go ahead and unlock my camera so we can really show this. See how it's all grainy now? I'm going to turn on denoise and let it sit for about 5 seconds, and there you go. Immediately, it gets smooth. Denoise does that. Now, it comes at a risk of making your image look too blurry, so be careful. And you can get around that by going to your image styles over here, making sure your denoise settings here, the denoise blend should be set to something lower than 1. If I bring this down to somewhere about 0.5 or 0.6, it's going to only be about half strength. It'll still be a little grainy for a little bit, but it's going to smooth out a lot of the worst noisy areas. And so you can use denoise to also speed up your rendering to make it get to a nice, not so grainy result with without waiting as long. So that's a whirlwind tour of the lighting presets as well as denoise. And lastly, when you go to do your final rendering, go into your render options and use either maximum samples or maximum time. If you have a strict budget, just set your number of minutes or hours and let it render. Or maximum samples, set a number that you want it to go to and then stop. It'll stop here automatically. If you're not familiar with custom control, don't use custom control. This will likely lead to much longer render times if you don't know what you're doing with it. And it's likely to look different than what you see here on screen. So that's my recommendation for you as far as best render settings for not so powerful machines, okay? So the next question asks, how can we use a video and apply it as a texture or a label? This way we can get things like animated screens for a mobile device or a computer, a TV, or a hologram, whatever it might be. And the cool thing is this is actually very easy to do. I don't remember the exact version in which KeyShot introduced this. Might have been around KeyShot 7, don't quote me on it, but I can at least demo for you how to set that up here today. Let's go do it. Okay, so if we want to add a video as a texture or a label in KeyShot, not so difficult to do. Here's a video I have. It's just a square video of a simulated cloth dropping on a cube. So I'm going to go ahead and use that inside this KeyShot scene. So I've got the file right here. It's an MP4 file. And inside KeyShot, I want to double click on the material or the object I want to set the video on. Then I'm going to go to its material graph. And here we see that we are using an image texture. So I'm going to right click and delete it. And now we have this emissive plane here. To get my video, I want to right click and go down to, I think it's textures, and then video map. And then here we want to go ahead and click and drag the connector to the color of the emissive, and then double click on the video map texture. And we have this place that we can load our frames. So let's click on the folder here, and it asks us to browse. And so I'm going to look in here and I'm going to load the video file here. And it's just an MP4 file. So we'll go ahead and hit open. And KeyShot tells us that this isn't actually a video, or sorry, it is a video. It's not an image sequence. It wants an image sequence. So it asks us if we can extract the frames, and we do want it to. We're going to change it to JPEG because PNGs take up more space, and this is just for a little demo. I don't care about quality here. And it's going to put them in the same folder, all those frames. If I'm not careful, if I don't choose a folder to put those in, it's just going to add them to the same location. So I'm going to create a new folder called frames. And I'll select that and hit select. And now it's going to unpack those frames into the folder called frames. And I'll hit OK. And it should just take a second. And there we go. We see a lot of frames. So if your video is really long, it's going to have a whole bunch of images. This was only 4 seconds and it had 130 frames. And then in this case, we see our giant cube on the wall. So we want to make sure that this is positioned the way we want it to. So we can scale it down or move it by clicking on our Move Texture button. We can say center it on part, fit to either X, Y, or Z. And then now that it's, see this orange outline, that's our video texture. If I rotate and hold Shift, we can orient it correctly. And now we want to scale it down. So I'll grab the corner of one of these cubes and start to drag in and hold Alt to center scale. So right now we have our video file centered in on our object here. So to test it, we need to, in the real-time view, hit A, and that brings up our animation timeline. And then if we hit play, we'll see that video file should play. So it's playing back a little slowly. Now it's actually playing more smooth, and you can see the effects in real time. If you want to adjust this, you can either do so in the material graph in this node, or you could go and adjust it in the animation timeline. If you click on this bar, you have the settings, so you can speed it up or slow it down. So we can say we want it to happen over 3 seconds, so we make it faster. So this will now play back faster than real time. And if we want this to emit light inside our emissive material here, we can always tell it to be brighter. And now it's pushing light out. And if we were to have a reflective material here, we would see the colors being reflected on our object here as well, which is quite cool. So that is how we have a video file as a texture. Nice and easy. So the next question is, how do we manage lights to achieve realism and make the image pop? And I actually want to kind of debate this a little bit. This question assumes that realistic images are images in which they pop. So what do they mean by that? When people say make it pop, they usually mean make the image have more contrast, make it more dynamic, make it stand apart from the background, whatever it might be, add some excitement. And let's be honest, unless you're in an environment where the lighting is really drastic in real life, there's a good chance that whatever you're seeing around you doesn't actually pop. It is not dramatic, it doesn't have that high contrast. And that's because most often when we walk into the room, the lighting is pretty consistent. There's a lot of light sources, the light bounces around. Now, in a render engine, we can achieve this in a few different ways. If we use HDRIs only, they're gonna replicate more of what we see in real life. With a couple of key differences. I don't want to get into the details there. But if you're saying, how do we make the image pop? That gets more into getting into studio style lighting, where we're actually going to set up individual lights to achieve highlights and shadows, and then really art direct the way those look. So I'm going to show you how I would do it using physical lights instead of an HDRI. And the realism is going to come from you understanding how real lights work in reality. Okay, so as far as achieving realism, I thought that when we started out with this file, it was pretty realistic looking. And I showed you the lighting setup I used for that. This is an apartment HDRI. So that's within our KeyShot library in the interiors. And I have this Dosh apartment 2K. And it looks like I desaturated it a little bit so it doesn't have too much color. So how do you do that? In our environment, you can go into the HDRI settings and click on the background, and then you can change your saturation over here, if needed. Now, you can make adjustments, and when it goes blurry like this, you need to click this refresh icon to generate the full res HDRI, otherwise things will be blurry in reflections and stuff. And as far as going ahead and making things pop, like I said, that sometimes comes from more high contrast lighting. HDRIs, again, are good for realism because they give your objects in the scene things to reflect, like the window and the furniture and other things like that. That's what makes this believable, in my opinion, at least. Now, if we have just a studio that doesn't have anything recognizable in it, like actually, let's go to the startup environment. This is a good example, I think. We'll go ahead and put this in here, and you'll see how if I go to just like a white background like this, it doesn't look horrible, but it lacks the contrast. It doesn't pop if you will. So like it just looks boring. And in my opinion, this is a result of having an environment that does not have enough in it to be reflected in the scene to make it interesting. So it's just too plain and bland. I'll turn it down, it's a little bit bright. But yeah, it's just overall, it's just not doing a good job in my opinion. So keep in mind when you're trying to get things to pop, like this looks very dull, it is very low contrast. That's because our HDRI is low contrast. If I use a higher contrast environment and I set the brightness to 1, we will see that we have more contrast. And if I go ahead and get into something like this, we have, again, a different look. So the more contrast you want in your reflections and highlights, then go for an HDRI that has more contrast as well. And that's going to help you out. You can use physical lights, but you know, I feel like that goes a little bit beyond the scope of this tutorial. Physical lights, I have a tutorial on dramatic lighting with physical lights, so maybe check that out. So the next one's asking, how do we create a 3D printed material? And I assume that this person's asking about achieving those kind of horizontal lines or the layers that an FDM printer would create. Good news is this is super easy. We can do this in KeyShot's material graph. So let's go ahead and demo that. All right, so for our 3D printed material, I think we'll use this little candle holder. I think that's a good example. So I'll hide everything except for this candle holder. And let's make this a 3D printed material. And also let's go to a more neutral environment like this, and we'll hit C just to go onto a solid white color background. Now, how do we get this looking like a 3D printed material? Let me go ahead and set my camera target really quickly. There we go. Move this guy over. And let's go ahead and start by making it plastic. So I'll search for my hard, shiny black plastic and just throw that on there as a starting point. Now I want to go ahead and edit the material graph. So we'll double click on our candlestick, go to our material graph. And now what we want to do is use a texture to create the ribbing or the layers or the bumps. So let's right click and go down to textures, and we'll grab a marble. So we're using marble again, which is interesting. Go ahead and hit C to preview this marble. And let's go ahead and take our thickness down to 0. Oopsies, not 0. Leave this at 1. Our noise down to 0, our noise scale down to 0, and then scale the entire thing down quite a lot. Let's just go down to 2. And let's take our color and set it to white, and our vein color to black. So now we have this black and white texture that's basically just creating a bunch of horizontal lines. And the way we stack these up, if we use these for the actual bump, we're going to get some interesting results. And my number 2 here suggests that each layer is 2 millimeters thick. And if we want to actually change the thickness of those veins, we can increase the thickness slider here, which is cool. Okay, so let's plug this into bump and see what happens. Looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and make the number a little bit higher. So we're going to go into our bump height and make it 0.5. And now it looks really bumpy. And the other thing that we can do is usually 3D printed objects are not quite so shiny. So let's take our plastic and set our roughness to 0.1 or maybe 0.05. And let's take our refractive index and make it higher, 0.55. So it's a little bit more shiny. And at this point, we're looking pretty good. Now, this is just a bump texture, nothing more. Bump textures do not give you actual thickness. It does not change the shape or the silhouette of the object. It just is a camera trick. So in most cases, this is going to be your best bet. Let's go ahead and also change the color of this plastic so it's a little easier to see. We'll go for like a dark gray or like a dark gray. Now, if you really want to take it a step further and give these bumps some thickness, you could try doing displacement on this, but I cannot guarantee the results will be pretty. Let's go ahead and try. Let's go to geometry, displace, plug this into geometry, plug this into displace. We don't need it in bump anymore. And now if we go into our displace, let's set our displacement height to 0.5 millimeters, so a very small amount. And let's go ahead and hit execute geometry node and see what happens. So as I thought, we got some very weird results. And this has more to do with the underlying geometry than it does this texture. This will work if our 3D model is set up properly. So I cannot guarantee that we can get this example to work, but here are a couple of ways we might be able to try. I'm going to disconnect this and then refresh. I will right click on our model and go down to retessellate, and it says we can't. And this is because I imported this model without NURBS, so we can't retessellate it. So we're out of luck there. Okay. In this case, we can go back to displace, plug that into geometry. We can try changing our triangle size to 0.5 millimeters. And sometimes the smaller the number we go here, the better results we'll get. But I can tell you right now, this is not going to work properly. If you want this tactic to work properly, you need to make sure that your 3D model has two criteria met. You need to have your tessellation, meaning the triangles that it's made out of, are as uniform as possible. So the retessellate feature in KeyShot will work if you import a NURBS-based model, and in your import settings, you have import NURBS checked. And then the second option, or the thing that you need to consider, is your normal direction has to be facing outward on the model. Unfortunately, this is another thing that's hard for CAD users to control, and it's hard to get that in KeyShot. But if you're coming from any other software, if you have access to, again, a free software like Blender, you can align the normals outward, and that will solve this issue for you before you use your displace function. So yeah, back to our first approach, which was just use this as a bump, and then you're off to the races. At least for now, this works. And this works with other material than plastic. You could do this with, say, a cloudy plastic, which gives you some nice translucency. We could add some color to it, make it like a reddish color. And set our scattering directionality back. Maybe make this quite a bit brighter. And maybe make this higher. And make our cloudiness like 0.5, 0.8, 0.9. Make sure that we're in product rendering mode. And that's going to give us the best results there. Pretty cool. Good question. So the next question's asking, how do we do custom curve animations? And this is a fairly new feature, KeyShot 9, and it's awesome. I've used it on many of my recent animations. And believe it or not, I actually did a live stream just a couple days ago on KeyShot's YouTube channel, so please check that out. I go way deep into animation. That said, I will show you how to use custom animation curves right here. Let's go do it. All right, custom curve animation. So we're going to go to our animation timeline, that is A on the keyboard. And now we want to move this candlestick using custom curve animation. We're gonna click on our animation wizard. We'll use a translation, and we'll say next, and we'll click on our object, and then we'll hit next again. And now we have it moving up in the y-axis, which is upward. We can see on our little XYZ coordinates in the lower left-hand corner of our KeyShot screen. Let's set our Y value to maybe 75. And now if we drag our timeline, our playhead along the timeline, it goes up. But it's going up in a linear fashion, and we want this to kind of spring upward with some more dynamic movement. And that's what custom curves are good for. So before we accept this animation wizard property, we'll change it from linear to custom. And next we get this cool green graph thing. This is going to be our custom curve. Now we want this thing to kind of shoot up, and we can have it start slow and then speed up and then slow back down. So in order to do that, we're going to click on this square handle, drag it down and to the right, and I'm holding shift to keep it moving in this direction. And I'm going to hold shift and do the top one in the opposite direction. And this is going to create what we call an S curve. And this is going to be, think of the acceleration. It goes faster as it goes up, but it also, time is going across the bottom axis. So as more time is passing, it's moving further. So the steeper the curve, the faster it's moving over time. So I'll go ahead and hit finish. And if we go ahead and play this, you'll see it goes up and then it repeats. So let's not have it loop. I'll turn off the loop button. And now it just moves up and slows down. Now, if we go and want to change those settings, click on the green bar and you'll see the settings in the lower right-hand corner. We can adjust those. So if I scroll down, we can say we want it to start slow and then accelerate up and finish going very fast. So that would be like creating a ramp shape like this. So it's going to start very, very slow and then it's going to shoot up toward the top. So very, very slow and then boom, it stops abruptly. We could do the opposite by having it start by jumping up quickly and then slowing down very slowly by creating an inverse of that first shape that we just, the shape that we just did. So now it goes fast and then it slows down gently. Now we can do something in between. We could have this maybe start out and go linear for a little while. And I would do that by getting rid of these handles. And now I can create another key by right-clicking. And then with this key, what I can do is have this go like this. So what's going on here is we have basically kind of a linear curve. So it starts out at a fairly decent speed, and then it slows down over time. So this is like an ease out. So if we play that back, it does that. And if we get really crazy by just like making this curve look all wobbly, we'll see kind of what this thing does. So it actually moves up and down because these two axes are representing time and distance. Distance in the y-axis and time in the x-axis. So if you're really good at visualizing this in your head, you can make some pretty crazy graphs. You can also go ahead and change things. Like if I want this animation to last 2 seconds, I could drag this out to the right to the 2-second mark, and now the whole thing lasts 2 seconds. So if you're really good with these curves, you can do some pretty cool wizardry. But for now, I usually use it to just kind of do speed ramps like I showed you in the beginning with the S-curve. So the next question is, how would we achieve a wood material that kind of actually shows some sort of wood texture, like wood grain, with some sort of color-coded sheen? So this is kind of a hybrid material. I would think of it almost like a painted wood. I would actually get into the material graph, probably start with a paint, and then just use a texture from a wood material. So let's actually take a look at how we would do that. All right, let's talk about this sort of wood grain material with some sort of paint or metallic sheen. But now what do we do if we want, again, this to look like a kind of a painted sort of material? Let's first make sure that we have a bump texture from our wood material. So I'm gonna double click on this and go to its material graph. And if this looks a little intimidating or confusing, don't worry about it. We have the color of our material here. We have a bump texture and we have a roughness texture. So if we want this to look like, again, kind of a painted wood or something like that, let's just go ahead and delete the wood texture from the color. And let's go to our plastic material and set this to be some sort of blue. Go like a dark, really dark blue. And if we want it to be really shiny, we need to have a pretty good refractive index, maybe 1.5. Now, if you're really crazy and you want this to actually read as metallic, you could take this way up to like 5, and now it's getting kind of crazy. And the other thing that we have going on is the roughness right now. If we were to plug this back into our roughness, now it's not quite so reflective. We can even preview this color to number and see the thing that we're getting for our, in fact, why do we have 2 of these? Why don't we just plug this into bump as well? So they match. So this going into our color to number here, let's get it out of our preview. Make sure our bump is high enough. We'll do 0.5 and this other one to be 0.5 as well. So now we have our wood texture, and into our color to number here, we have the roughness. So if we want this to be a little shinier, we need to make everything darker. So we're going to darken this up. And now we have kind of like a painted wood that still has a texture. And if we want it to be shinier, we could say maybe 0.6, 1.7. And there's your kind of metallic sheen, but still having a wood texture underneath. And then of course the realistic, the realism is going to come from really dialing in your wood texture and making sure it's mapped correctly on your part so we don't see things like this ugly side grain here. So the next question's asking how to be good. I don't know, Sean. I'm trying to figure that out myself. I don't know. So I think the next question's asking about how to split up geometry using KeyShot's edit geometry function. So there's a tool in KeyShot that allows us to split apart surfaces, and that's going to enable us to put different materials and textures on each surface. So I'll walk you through how I would use that really quickly. Okay, so as far as the split or edit geometry function, I'm not sure if the question had more to do with organizing an assembly or if they are just curious about splitting apart geometry. What we'll do is go ahead and just do the split object surface function, which is what I would expect the person to be asking. So I'm going to hold Alt and left click on this bowl to hide everything else. Now let's go ahead and split the geometry. We'll do that by right clicking and going down to split separate, split object surfaces. KeyShot changed this recently for KeyShot 9. Split separate object means separate multiple bodies that are not actually connected, whereas split object surfaces allows me to take this one object and make sure its surfaces can be separated from one another. And this is done usually by using something called a splitting angle. So right now we see all these little polygons, and if I hold shift and click and drag, we can select them. But it's not very useful, and it doesn't select through either. Kind of weird. What I recommend is using a splitting angle. So what I recommend doing is using a splitting angle, and when I set the split angle to 45, which is the default, and I click, so now if I want to reduce the splitting angle to something like 5 degrees and hit enter, it should only select surfaces that have less than a 5-degree change or delta in their surface continuity, which sounds complex, I guess, but it's basically selecting surfaces that are pretty much parallel or tangent, I guess. If I bring this down to 2 and hit enter, let's see if that reduces my selection. There we go. So depending on this number, it's going to select more and more parts. Now, I modeled this bowl to be curvature continuous. I didn't want any sharp edges, which is why we have to bring this number so small. If this was like a flat surface here, instead of a rounded edge, I could leave a much higher number for the splitting angle. And then to do this, I would click split surface, and now we have 2 separate parts, and I can turn them on and off individually. And then when we're done, I'll go ahead and click apply, and now our bowl can receive a different material on the different surface. That's how I would split surfaces. So we have another question about lighting, and this time they say, how do we create realistic lighting? And this is a huge topic. I'm sorry to say I don't have an answer for you here. I have recommendations, and that is going to be to study. Lighting is like an art form. Whether you're a photographer or a painter or someone who's doing rendering, knowing how light works and how to use it to create an image is, again, an art form, but the more you know about it, the easier it is to manipulate it. I've done lots of things to improve my understanding, everything from reading books to watching tutorials to trying experiments. Even picking up a camera and learning how to do some photography is a great way to get better at realistic lighting. Now, as far as this pertains to KeyShot, my main suggestion is going to be whatever situation you're trying to replicate to make a scene look realistic, reference how it worked in real life, and then try to replicate that in KeyShot. So in your KeyShot scene, if you can recreate every light source and make sure that the color and the temperature and the brightness and the size of those lights is accurate, then your rendering should look quite realistic. Again, I think we kind of addressed the whole realistic lighting thing, but I will go ahead and do this. Let's take this scene here and let's go ahead and add an area light. So I'm going to go to edit, add geometry, and then add a plane. And I will drag this plane up above everything else and rotate it a little bit. And let's change its material type to area light. So I double click the plane and go down to area and change its color to be from very blue to something in the middle of this Kelvin range. If you don't see Kelvin, it's just hidden under a drop down here. And now the brightness is set to 1000. 1600 lumen is equivalent to the brightness of a 100 watt incandescent light bulb, if you remember how bright those were. If I uncheck apply to back of geometry, it will turn the light off from the backside, and then we have light coming out the front. So is this affecting our scene very much? Well, if I turn off my brightness for my environment, you will see that this area light is indeed bright enough to illuminate our scene. You'll notice that our shadows are jet black. Let me go ahead and turn on apply to back so we can see this. So you'll notice our shadows are jet black, and that's because we don't have any ambient light in our scene to brighten up those shadows. So that is going to make our shadows a little too dark. Now we could add another area light on the other side so they're not so dark, or we can use an HDRI and increase the brightness of that HDRI a little bit. So now our shadows aren't so blacked out. This is often how I create what I think is the most realistic lighting. I use area lights for my main light source, and just a couple of them, not a lot. And then I use an HDRI, and I'm not usually too picky about it, but we see the windows here reflecting. So if you don't want those windows, you got to use either a different HDRI or rotate it. And then just use that HDRI for some ambient light like I'm doing here. Again, if it's all the way black, then it's not realistic. If we add a little bit of ambient light, this makes our rendering look a little bit better. So I don't know if this is truly realistic, but I think that this usually produces the nicest results in KeyShot. So I hope that's useful. So our next question is how to render toilet. Really? How to render toilet paper? So the next question is asking, how do we render realistic light moving through a crystal lamp? So I'm pretty sure this person's asking because maybe they tried to do some sort of chandelier design or something and they found it to look weird. My guess is that by using having lots of bodies that were made of either crystal or glass or plastic or some other clear material, they found that they were getting some weird results. There's a good chance when you have a lot of these transparent materials with lots of kind of non-linear surfaces, you're going to get these things called black occlusions, where light doesn't actually transmit through the material properly. And so this is likely because you don't have enough ray bounces. I would start by getting into some of our render settings, and I can give you some suggestions as to what you might be able to do to help your results. Okay, so I took this glass and I kind of changed the shape of it, and then I also made a pattern of it around itself. We're pretending this is a chandelier or some sort of like a crystal lamp or something like the question asked. So really, again, I don't know what the issue is without seeing an image of what you're talking about, but one thing that you could do here is play around with things like lighting, obviously. So if your lighting is too bright, it's just looking ugly like this. This is no good. So we could have to reduce the lighting a little bit, maybe. If we want a solid white background, we could go to color. And this doesn't look good either, but it's good to have some kind of contrast or some sort of background, mid-range background color. So we can see both the highlights and the dark areas. Now in our render presets, if we go to basic, this won't look good. If this is what I suspect you're running into, you're getting these black areas, these inclusions. So if you don't have high enough ray bounces, this is going to be an issue. As we increase our ray bounces, that's going to go away. So there's a limit. You don't, it's like after the black parts go away, I don't get any more benefit. So don't go all the way up to a really high number. It'll just make your rendering slower. Just go as high as you need to not have any more of those ugly black areas, and then you should be good overall. So in this case, about 14 is pretty good, so you can use product mode. And then lastly, maybe caustics could be helpful. But again, it only depends on the scene. In this case, it doesn't help me here. So there's a chance you may not need it either. So the next question is, how do we learn more about the material graph? Well, I have more than 10 episodes of what started out as Material Graph Monday. It kind of became this how to render series because I want to do more than just Material Graph tutorials, but I have a lot of content, probably more than 6 or 7 hours worth of Material Graph tutorials on this YouTube channel. So please subscribe if you haven't already. Leave me comments and thumbs up if you like this. Drop suggestions in the comments below. And last but not least, check out the Material Graph Monday / how to render playlist on this channel, and you'll probably find what you need. Yeah, so like I said, if you want to head on over to Will Gibbons or my YouTube channel, just search Will Gibbons, it'll pop up. And here you can see I did one on stainless steel, a worn painted steel, flickering candle, ripstop nylon, speckled ceramic, realistic wood, corrugated cardboard, cloudy plastic, holographic thing, machine metal, hand sanitizer. It's like I have a lot of different things. All of these use the Material Graph in one way or the other. So I recommend you checking out this playlist, and if you like it, let me know. So the last question we have is, how do we render a sand or soil kind of material on a ground plane? So how would we achieve like a desert or a beach, I guess? And this is pretty tough. I'm not sure I have a good answer for you. Honestly, I'm gonna suggest that you start off with a model that comes from or was probably made in a software other than a CAD software. You know, you can use free software like Blender, and you can grab information from Google Earth and use satellite data to actually recreate geographical sort of features, if you will. Now, if you really have to use KeyShot and you just want to put some sort of image on a ground plane, I'll do my best, I'll try, but no promises. Let's see how this one works out. Okay, so we have our sad, lonely spoon that for some reason you want to put on the beach or the desert. We could add a ground plane, going up to edit, add geometry, add ground plane, or we could try another option, which, I don't know, might work if we did something like a backdrop ramp. And actually, Luxion moved this to be under the models. So up here in the library, if you go to backdrop ramp and drag that in, takes a second, and it's really big, like really huge. I'm gonna go ahead and scale it down quite a bit. That will do, I guess. And then smash it down so, oh my goodness. Scale it so it's not quite so tall. I can't do that, it's jumping around too much. So I'll go ahead and hit the snap to ground button, move it forward a little bit, and then the green checkbox, and then I'll grab the spoon, do the same thing. So we'll grab our spoon, and I'll hit snap to ground, and we will move it back so it's on the backdrop. Okay, good enough. So how are we gonna make this look? Let's go ahead and set our camera target real quick. It's easier to navigate. And we want to rotate this down. And again, close enough. So sand. I'm gonna have to go onto a website to get some sand. Let's go to Unsplash. And it's a good website to get free images. It's always good to credit the creators, but it's not 100% necessary. So if I search for desert, we'll find some desert images. And maybe something like this will do. I'll go ahead and click on this one. I like it. Let's go ahead and download it. So I'll actually just hit this download button here. I guess we'll allow it. And then what I want to do, show where this ended up. There we go. I'm going to put this into KeyShot and add it as a color map. And it looks weird because mine is set to UV. Let's set it to planar. And let's try moving it. So, oh boy. It's upside down and backwards, I guess. So let's go ahead and rotate that. I'm holding shift. Okay. And obviously at this point, this is a flat image. In KeyShot, If this like plane was UV'd properly, we could get this to wrap around and create some sort of cool backdrop. It's not likely going to work in this case. So I may just have to put this on a couple of different planes. So we'll go ahead and hit this green checkbox. I'm going to add a ground plane, which is Control G. Shift left click to copy this material. Control Shift right click to paste it. I'm going to hide the backdrop plane. And then take this one and do something a little weird. I'm going to scale this image up. And where is it? Scale it up. There we go. And then I'm going to say do not repeat. And I'm going to, this whole plane is too big, so let's scale that down. Let's go to 0.5, 0.25. There we go. And then let's duplicate this plane. Duplicate selection, I guess. Or rotate pretty much 90 degrees. 60 maybe, I don't know. Maybe move it up a bit. I don't know. I don't know if this is gonna work. And then this guy, let's go ahead and move this one. Something like that. Yeah, this isn't going to work so well. I have a feeling. I am sorry. I have failed you. This is a weird request, I'll be honest, but I understand why you would want to do it. I just don't think this is a very good method of doing it. I don't think using planes is going to look realistic. Oopsies. If you had something that was UV properly and you were able to just get the image to kind of wrap up like around a curve, and if it was really big, maybe you could fake it, and then in the distance you could use depth of field to kind of blur those. You know, if I go ahead and turn on the depth of field with D, and then I use my where's my camera here? If I select my focus distance on this part here, and then I set this to like, I don't know, 25 or something, or 10 or something, maybe 5. Maybe we could fake it a little bit. But yeah, I'll be honest with you, I'm not too jazzed with this solution, but it is what it is. Maybe you're into it. Let's go ahead and just rotate this properly. I'm having trouble with this here. There we go. So maybe if our focus was like on our spoon, like really, really tight like this, we could, I mean, that maybe that counts. I don't know, man. I don't know. That's kind of cool. I'm kind of psyched on that. If we go to our HDRI editor and maybe colorize the thing a little bit, make it a little blue. Maybe make it quite a bit brighter. Add some contrast, huh? I'm thinking more color. There we go. We got that kind of cool day by night, sort of Mad Maxian, sort of ridiculous. Yeah. I don't know, man. Hopefully that answers your question. It's pretty ghetto, but I suppose it works. I'm kind of mystified. I'll take a screenshot. Who knows? There you guys have it. KeyShot Q&A number 3 in the bag. And this time we did it by video. And if you like this format, let me know and I'll try to do some more of these. I think it could be fun. I like interacting with you guys. I like answering your questions, and who knows, maybe if this lends itself to doing some live streams as well as pre-recorded tutorials, I'll do that. But anyway, I'm all ears. If you guys want to know more about what I do, head on over to willgibbons.com. And if you want to get on my email list, willgibbons.com/subscribe. And you can get on my email newsletter, and that way, anytime there's something new and noteworthy, I will shoot you an email and you will be in the know. But until next time, you guys, happy rendering.